welcome. I am very excited to share with you the very first installment of my Enchanted Witch in a Fantasy Land Giulietta's Ceremonial Gown Sakizo build. That's a lot. That's a lot to take in. So essentially I'm making this. And I am finally able to share with you the creation of the bodice. In this video, I'm going to walk through my process for how I made it, share with you some of the things that I learned along the way. You're going to see some frustration as well because this was not easy. If that sounds like something you're interested in and you want to see the rest of this build, make sure to hit that subscribe button. If you liked this video, make sure to hit the like button. And if you have any questions or comments, always pop those down below. Always happy to hear from you and answer any questions. Let me just say a few things in advance. What you're going to see is the creation of it, but I have not finished two things on this. I have not put the bottom gold detailing around the edge of the corset because I'm waiting for that to get here, and then I have not put the eyelets in the back, but that is fine because everything else is really the most important thing. I also used velvet for the red color to match the sort of deep red color that we see in the artwork. It's watercolor, and I thought velvet would kind of give off that same feeling. And then in the end, I used a 1/4 inch gold, metallic gold leather trim for the stripes, and then I used a metallic gold simplicity braid detail for the top gold trim and the bottom gold trim, and then some pearl glass beads for the detailing. And the inner stabilizer or interfacing is a 10-pound Duct canvas. I used twill tape for the waist tape, and then I purchased boning channel casing from Corset Making Supplies because I didn't want to be bothered making my own boning channels. So that's all my materials list. I'll pop them down in the comments below so you can reference that as well. I'll also put some links. They're not affiliated links. I'm not that cool, but it will show you where I personally purchased some of these items. Also for this, I used exclusively organ needles. They actually approached me at MomoCon and gave me some samples of their needles. One of them that I used is an anti-glue needle, which has a special coating that prevents basting glue and other adhesives from sticking to the needle and gumming up your machine and your work. I used that. It was amazing. I also used their standard universal needle. That one I actually purchased myself because after they approached me, I got curious of their other offerings and purchased a lot. So they were kind enough to gift me some of their needles. This is not sponsored at all, but I had such a great experience with that anti-glue needle, which I do have a short that I posted, which I'll pop up here if you want to watch it. I had such a great experience with that I will be using organ needles exclusively on this build because I want to test out their durability and their longevity. And I will say, I did sew directly onto my presser foot with one of their needles, and though it bent the tip, it did just the very, very pointy tip. It didn't bend the needle shaft at all, and it didn't explode like my other needles. So that's a good sign. And I will give an update on those probably in about 6 months or so because this is going to be at least a 6-month build. I can only work on this in evenings and weekends since I do have a day job, so it's going to take me a while because this is a very intricate piece. But the goal here is to compete in either New York City Comic-Con or C2E2 or Florida SuperCon, somewhere that is a crown qualifier. That's the goal. I want to compete in Crown Championship. What is Crown Championship? Well, it is a pretty big competition circuit where you get to start off by competing regionally at New York City Comic-Con, C2E2, and Florida SuperCon. I think those are the only three. If you win one of those, you're considered a regional winner, and then they take you to C2E2 in Chicago. At C2E2, you compete for the national title. If you win the national title, you then move on to compete for the global title. C2E2 is a little strange because the regional for them happens, and then immediately after that, the national title happens, and then immediately after that, they crown the crown winner. So it all happens all together in Chicago once a year. But my hope is to place in regional. And I originally was going to try for New York City Comic Con, and I was going to try for Florida SuperCon, and now I'm like, maybe I should just go straight to C2E2. So I don't know where that's going. It really depends on where I'm going to be in this build, because the timing of those conventions are all over the place. But for now, this is the first installment. There will be many more to come as I finish the next pieces, and I'm very excited to share them with you. So I think I've said this once, but if I haven't, if that's something you're interested in, make sure to hit the subscribe button and turn your notifications on so you'll be notified when I post. I also post weekly updates where I give like chatty little updates of my thought processes and progress that I've made, but I don't go into too much craftsmanship detail because I save that for the bigger updates. But now that I've plugged all of that, let's hop on into it. I needed to make a custom corset for the bodice, so I started with the duct tape method. This is where you wrap yourself in plastic wrap, then wrap yourself in duct tape, and draw your seams directly on the duct tape, creating a pattern that is customized to your body. You want to wear the undergarments that you plan to wear under the bodice when you're doing this. I conveniently forgot, which led to me needing far more adjustments to this pattern than typical. So after the duct tape is applied, I drew out all of my seams and my waistline so I knew what pattern pieces I need cut. And then of course had the help of a friend, in this case my husband, who helped draw the back pieces. And then very, very carefully pulling the duct tape away from my body, I cut the duct tape off. And this gave me a 3D replica of my body shape. Of course, I forgot to do this while wearing it, but after the fact, I made sure to mark which panel was which so that I didn't get confused later. And that is my duct tape pattern. Now it's time to make a mock-up and make any adjustments needed so that I have the perfect fit. I personally really like to transfer my patterns over onto muslin. A lot of other people use poster board or tissue paper. It's cheaper to use paper. I just really like the flexibility and the durability of cloth. So that is what I typically transfer all my patterns onto. And once I have the pattern to a place where I like it, after all of the mock-ups you're about to see me do, I will permanently transfer it onto another piece of muslin and then also digitize it in Illustrator so that I have a permanent copy of my custom corset. You can kind of see here all the pattern pieces drawn out, and after I've copied all my pieces onto the cloth, I add a 1/4 inch seam allowance around each piece, and I also make sure to transfer over any markings such as my waistline. I actually started with this satin brocade fabric, but in the end I wound up making my first mock-up out of canvas. I use canvas as the interfacing, whatever you want to call it, layer, the middle layer of the corset. It is cheap and durable, and it works really, really well for corsets. Okay, so really bad fit at first. It is quite big on me. I did put the proper undergarments on this time, and I can really tell the difference between the fits, so I need to make some adjustments. So first I want to take out a chunk in the cup. It is just way too big up there. And then I need to readjust my side seam so that it pulls the front in where I need it to create a little bit of reduction. And then of course there's a lot of gaping in the back, so I need to remove some back there. The next step is to retrace out the pattern by taking apart the mock-up and adding in the adjustments that I had marked on the mock-up itself, and to cut it out and make it again. Mock-up number 2. So I really like the shape of the front. I like the angle of the front boning. Love the way that this front looks with the angles. I'm not as big of a fan of the side, but the back looks really nice with the straight lines, but the lacing is a bit too close together for what I prefer, so it's still a bit too big. I really want a 3-inch gap in the back. And of course we still have this gaping in the cups. I think if I maybe take it in the front center, I might be able to address some of this gaping. So I'm going to pin and mark where I want to make that, and I'm just going to attempt a front center seam here. So very carefully cutting this off of my body. And I don't like the change. I don't like how it changed the shape of everything, and I lost that sort of beautiful angle that I wound up really liking in the first place. To curve out this part and bring it inward a little bit, so hopefully that will give a little pull to the top so that I can revert the top change that I just made back to the previous mock-up and get that beautiful shape back. I just need to make sure that I am labeling everything as the revisions so I don't get confused later. I'm going to keep my center front the same, but I'm going to bring in the side center a bit at the side to try and take care of that gaping. Okay, mock-up number 6, and those adjustments definitely caused some additional fit issues to pop up. So we're back to having all of this gaping. You can see, well, I was looking online, and the way to fix that is to take it in here. Time for mock-up number 7. Okay, so that adjustment put me right back to where I was on fit number like 3. Flattening my shape. So I think I figured it out. I'm just going to take it in here at the side because this fits quite nicely. We just have a little gaping here. I'm just going to take it in a little here, and then I'm actually going to adjust the back and try that on, and hopefully that looks all right. Okay, so I've completed 2 more mock-ups, making this, what, 9, I think? And I am in love with most of it. So ignore the fact that I don't have any boning in the front. So like that changes the shape of it quite a bit. But I love the front seams, the fit in the waist. The back looks great. I love the shape of the panels. I just hate sweetheart necklines. I struggle so much getting this gaping right here from gaping. And you can see how far, like from the side, like there's a lot of cleavage out, and that is stressful. I do feel secure. It's just, yeah, when I bend over. Sorry, you guys are getting a lot of cleavage. I just don't typically wear things like this, I guess, and it's just, I'm getting a little self-conscious about it. But essentially, I have raised it up on the side here, and I need to raise up the back panels as well. And part of me is thinking about raising this, but I am going to make one more, and if it works, that's it. So I'm going to do one more with the spiral steel boning I plan to use, so I can see how everything is going to fit, and then make the decision on whether or not I can make this work. So after 9 mock-ups and this disaster we see here, I have a functional mock-up that I totally forgot to record, but I went ahead and redrew out my pattern onto muslin, made sure my seam allowance was there and all my other markings. Apparently I forgot to mark my waistline though, and my grain line. That will come into play later. But I decided to use some leftover cotton fabric I have for the lining, which happens to be Ariel. I prefer to line all of my corsets with cotton just for breathability reasons. Corset's already a bit hot and heavy, and this just makes me feel a bit more comfortable. So I did start out with cutting out my lining, and then moved on to cutting my fabric out of velvet and canvas. The velvet likes to move around like crazy, so I decided to do some hand basting across all of the panels to keep the velvet from moving when I go to serge these together and then stitch them together. So that took about a day for me to do. I don't know if my basting stitches are at all correct, but this is how I do it. Just some long diagonal stitches up and down the piece, and it seems to work all right for me. To keep the canvas from fraying and the velvet from falling apart, I serged all of my seams together. This just gives a nice clean finish and keeps everything durable. And then it's just a matter of piecing everything together. So I started with the front center panels and worked my way out from there. So it's very important to iron your seams flat with a corset, as well as iron in the curves of the corset utilizing a tailor's ham. However, I don't have any of the tools that you typically use to iron velvet. If you iron velvet as is, it flattens the pile and ruins the look of the velvet. So they do make things like a nail board or something like that so that you can iron it like normal and not destroy the fabric. But this is my way of getting around that. I just very carefully, with my iron on hot and steam, I hold the fabric over it, use the steam to heat it up thoroughly through both layers, and then gently press on the seam with my fingers, being extraordinarily careful to not touch the hot plate of the iron. I can't recommend this because it is dangerous, but it is what I do. So be cautious when you do silly things like this. But it works. After this, I then went to attach the gold stripes to the corset following the seams of the corset, and I absolutely could not get it to stay still.
I just figured it out. So I have this is military braid, as they called it. No idea why it's called that. Maybe it's used in military forms, I don't know, but it's some sort of trim that is very pretty, and it has some flex to it. Here, let me show you.
It is a woven trim. It's got a rough side and a smooth side. I'm assuming the smooth side is the part that's supposed to go down, and it has this lovely sparkle to it. And it flexes. It bends side to side. So my original thought was maybe it would bend like bias tape, but it does not have that kind of flex to it. But I need it to go down the seam of my corset, and I have been struggling so much with this. Because when you sew it, the pile of the velvet, which is the little bits of fabric that stick up, giving velvet its texture and its look, they squish left or right or down or up in random directions. On top of that, the way that they squish pushes the trim in the opposite direction, leading to very wobbly, crooked lines when I need this to look nice and straight. I can't pin it in place. I would need a pin along every single millimeter of this to hold it in place. And then when I pull the pin out, I'm sure it would be puckered where the pin was. My husband made an interesting comment about why don't you put interfacing under the trim to keep it from flexing? And, well, I had no response to that, so I gave it a try. And it weirdly seems to work, as you can see with this one line that I have sewn into the corset. So this is what I did. I took some heavyweight interfacing and I cut out all of my trim to the length that I need it to be. Now that I have it cut, I'm going to sew it directly onto the interfacing on both sides of the trim. I cut each piece out a little under the edge of the trim so that none of that interfacing would be visible when I sew this to the corset. And then this is where it got a little tricky. So I have reduced the flexibility of the trim, but the pile of the velvet is still mobile. So I developed a 2-foot system of how to get this trim to stay in place and stitch mostly straight. First, I start with this foot. It has 2 teeth on it. There's like just about the exact same size as the trim. It's called the open embroidery foot. This foot allows me to stitch directly down the center of the trim while each side of the trim is held down by the teeth of the presser foot. So this allows me to anchor the trim in place. Now the next part is to get the edges stitched down without them moving around. So I used this edge stitch foot, which has a little metal piece slightly off center from the needle that held the edge of the trim down while the needle came through and stitched it to the corset. It weirdly worked out. These are all feet that came with the Yaya Han sewing machine, by the way. So once all those were stitched on, I just needed to do a little cleanup. I think I'm happy with this, but in all honesty, which I explain later, I was not. I did not like this yellow with the red, but I went ahead and kept moving forward.
I hate my corset, and let me show you why.
It is puckering around all of this trim, and it just looks awful, and I hate the color. I think I know why this happened. I forgot to pay attention to the grain of my fabric when I cut my pattern out of my velvet, which means that there will be some stretch to it. So when I try to put this together, things are just going to stretch out, and I think that is what happened. I also think the military braid is too stiff for the velvet. It sinks into the velvet and doesn't give any sort of flex when I'm stitching it, and I think somehow that is just causing additional puckering. I decided to remake it. I have recut out all of my pieces of canvas and velvet. I made sure to cut out the pattern pieces appropriately, and I am just hand basting around the edges of the velvet instead of all down the middle. And I do have a couple that I'm testing basting glue on. I will tell you, it looked horrible. I couldn't wash it out without ruining the velvet, and it was just not a good idea. But I did try it on those. I had to remake those in the end. So here is the new corset. The cups look so much smoother. There's still a little wrinkling around the waist, but I think given the nature of just the corset and how the panels are, I don't think I'm gonna get away from all of that. But I do think I can smooth some of this out with the rest of the construction of the corset itself. But I'm much happier with this. I rounded out the bust cups when I remade this one because I realized that my duct tape pattern was flawed because I wasn't wearing any sort of support, and it wound up flattening me out. I also made a few changes in the order of operations that I did for this. So last time I sewed the corset together and then did the trim and then did the waist tape, and then I was going to do the boning channels, but instead with this one I decided to do the waist tape next, followed by the trim, followed by the boning channels. The waist tape is just an additional piece of twill tape that goes across the waistline of your corset. It keeps the fabric from stretching out. This waist tape takes a lot of the strain of the tightening, so it's important to install one. I actually hand stitched in all of the boning channels because I did not want the stitching to show through the front of the corset. I did go ahead and add in some additional fray check for stability around anything that I trimmed after serging. And I changed up my trim. This is a 1/4 inch metallic gold leather trim, which looks a million times better than the military braid, both because of the color and the type of fabric. It just looks nicer. It looks less costumey. I did add in an eyelet panel. This is something that I took from historical corsetry. It's just a small panel with additional boning structure in it to support the eyelets. Since I am currently on a weight loss journey, I put the eyelets in the grommet panel. If I lose any more weight, I can remove this panel and add the eyelets to the next panel over. However, when I held this up to myself, I found out that this is actually still too big. So I think I may have lost a little bit of weight from when I actually made my mock-ups, so I wound up removing this panel altogether. So after this, next comes cutting my spiral steel boning. I will not go into any details about how to cut boning, how to cap boning, or any of that. I have a whole video dedicated to this process, which I will put up in the cards and also link down in the description for your reference. Also, if you make corsets and you don't have this adapter for the Dritz snap pliers from Farthingales, what are you doing? This will make your life a million times easier. Only works with the aluminum boning caps, but it is so worth it. Highly recommend. After capping all my boning and inserting it into the boning channels, it was time to move on to the lining, which you can see I used a couple different kinds of aerial fabric because I had to make so many adjustments, and I ran out of the other. I did put the back boning channels directly into the lining since I am no longer using the grommet panel, and I want to make sure that those eyelets are stabilized with the additional boning. So that is how I got around the boning stitching showing through the velvet. So this took a little bit of finagling because the lining I had cut and stitched together before I made some adjustments, so I just wound up pinning it in and making some adjustments both by hand sewing and generally by cutting parts of it to make it fit because I did not feel like remaking it. And then I went around and top stitched all around this to secure the lining. I don't do bag lining when it comes to corsets. I always use bias tape around my raw edges rather than doing the bag lining techniques. So that is what I'm going to do. It's really easy. You just take some bias tape, which I used 1/4 inch bias tape. It doesn't really match the color of my corset, but I was okay with that because it's going to get covered up anyway. And you take the skinny side of the double fold bias tape, you open it up, and you stitch the skinniest side down onto the right side of your fabric. Stitch that all the way around, and then later you will flip it over and stitch it down again. Now this is the worst bias binding job I've ever done in my life, so please ignore it. It looks terrible, but I didn't really care all that much because it is going to get hidden by this beautiful gold trim, which I hand stitched in. Now what I'm using here is a beeswax. You can buy this at Joann's. If you're going to do any sort of hand stitching, especially with this metallic gold thread, you should wax your thread. This will allow it to go through the fabric a lot easier. It keeps it from tangling, and with the metallic gold thread, it keeps the thread itself from splitting apart, which is a problem with this type of thread. So always use some sort of wax to ensure that you do get some nice clean stitching and it's less frustrating. So after I stitched all of this in, I also hand stitched in some glass pearl beads to match the artwork, which of course I did not record, but you can see it in the finished video here. Once I get the eyelets put in, I will show you probably in a short what it looks like on, but I'm very happy with this. Now you'll notice that this does not match the picture just yet, and that is because the white part of this bodice I'm actually going to create as a separate leather piece, kind of like an armor chest plate type thing. So more to come on that. So I hope all that made sense. It was a month-long build, I think, and I only had to remake it twice, so that's exciting. But I think it turned out well, and I think it's going to lay beautifully under the leather underbust corset breastplate thing that I will be making. So that white piece that you see in the artwork, I'm making that out of leather. I'm very excited for that, and I think the next part will be the crinoline and petticoat and mocking up the skirts, unless I get very inspired and decide to do the leather part next. So we will see. But that's what I have for you today, and I will see you in my next video. Bye!